It was 3:18 in the morning when I found myself sitting on my bathroom floor, laptop balanced on my knees, responding to emails that could have waited until Monday. My back hurt, my eyes burned, and I was wearing the same pajamas I'd put on 2 days earlier because I hadn't left my apartment except to grab takeout from the Chinese place downstairs. This wasn't rock bottom, this was Tuesday. You know that feeling when you're so tired that you're not even tired anymore? When you've pushed past exhaustion into this weird state where you're just existing? That was me. 55 hours a week at my financial consulting job, plus another 10 to 15 hours doing client follow-ups, preparing presentations, and attending networking events that I convinced myself were mandatory. I was 30 years old, making $78,000 a year, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen my friends on a weekend. Actually, I could. It was Sarah's birthday in April. It was now September. Here's what nobody tells you about the hustle culture trap. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't wake up one day and decide to sacrifice your entire life for your career. It's gradual, it's insidious. First, you stay late one night to finish a project. Your boss notices, you get praised. That feels good, so you do it again. Then you start checking emails on Sunday mornings, just to stay ahead. Before you know it, you're that person who responds to Slack messages at midnight and takes calls during vacation. And everyone around you is doing the same thing, so it feels normal. It feels like that's just what successful people do. But let me paint you a picture of what my life actually looked like. I'd wake up at 6:30, hit snooze twice, finally drag myself out of bed at 7. Shower, coffee, stare at my phone while pretending to eat breakfast. Commute for 45 minutes. Arrive at the office by 8:30, already exhausted. Meetings from 9 to noon. Lunch at my desk while catching up on emails. More meetings, client calls, spreadsheets, presentations. Leave the office around 6:30 or 7. Commute home. Order dinner because I was too tired to cook. Work on my laptop until 10 or 11. Collapse into bed. Repeat. 55 hours minimum, every single week. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. I was supposed to meet my parents for dinner. My dad's birthday. I'd promised them weeks earlier that I'd be there, no matter what. 6 o'clock rolled around, and I was still in a meeting that had started at 4. A meeting that should have been an email, by the way. I texted my mom. Running late, start without me. Then at 7, so sorry, still at work, probably another hour. At 8:15, I finally left the office. I got to the restaurant at 9:10. They were finishing dessert. My dad looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Not angry, just sad. Disappointed. He said to me later that night, "How did you get here, Vera? How are you working this much and still so stressed?" I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know when it had happened. When I'd become this person who missed her own father's birthday dinner, who lived in pajamas, who hadn't been to a yoga class in 8 months even though I kept paying for the membership, who felt guilty every time she took a lunch break. I looked successful from the outside. Good job, nice apartment in the city, decent salary. But behind the carefully curated Instagram posts and the professional headshot on LinkedIn, I was drowning. And I knew something had to change. That night, after my parents dropped me off at my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my dad's question, how did I get here? So I did what any millennial does when they can't sleep and need answers. I started Googling work-life balance, how to work less, productivity hacks, and that's when I stumbled across it, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. I'd heard of it before, dismissed it as unrealistic Silicon Valley bro nonsense. But at 3 in the morning, sitting on my bathroom floor because the light was better there and I didn't want to wake my roommate, I downloaded it. I read the entire thing in 2 days. And here's the really messed up part. My first reaction wasn't excitement, it was anger. Because if this was possible, if people were actually living this way, working smarter instead of harder, batching tasks, eliminating nonsense, automating systems, then what had I been doing for the last 5 years? Had I been torturing myself for nothing? The book talked about elimination, automation, delegation, these 4 pillars that were supposed to transform how you work. And I kept thinking, this can't be real. This is too good to be true. But I was desperate enough to try. So I made a decision. 90 days. I'd give myself 90 days to test every principle in that book. I'd track my hours obsessively, document what worked and what was complete fantasy. See if it was actually possible to reduce my working hours while maintaining my output and keeping my job. Because here's the thing, I didn't want to quit. I didn't want to become a digital nomad or start a dropshipping business. I just wanted my life back. I wanted to work to live, not live to work. Sound familiar? So that's where this story starts. September 15th, 55 hours a week. Burned out, exhausted, and barely holding it together. With a PDF of the 4-hour workweek open on my laptop and a Google spreadsheet ready to track every single hour. I had no idea if this would work. I had no idea if my boss would fire me or if my clients would revolt. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living like this. The 50-hour hell I was trapped in wasn't sustainable. Something had to change. And if you're sitting there right now, reading this at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep, working on a Saturday because you're behind, or missing another dinner because you're still at the office, I see you. This is for you. Let me show you what happened when I actually tried it. Monday morning, September 18th. I walked into my office with a notebook, 3 different colored pens, and a level of determination that probably looked insane to my coworkers. My plan was simple. For the next 7 days, I would track every single minute of my workday, every email, every meeting, every task, every interruption. Because here's what Ferriss says in the book that hit me like a truck. Most people have no idea where their time actually goes. They think they're being productive, but they're just being busy. And I realized that was me. I had no clue what I actually did all day. The first principle in the 4-hour workweek is elimination. Not delegation, not automation. Elimination. Getting rid of tasks that don't need to exist in the first place. Ferriss talks about the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. 20% of your effort produces 80% of your results, which means 80% of what you're doing is basically waste. When I first read that, I thought, no way, not me. I'm efficient. Every task I do is important. But I decided to test it anyway, so I started tracking. Day 1 was humbling. Brutally, embarrassingly humbling. I got to the office at 8:45, checked my email for 20 minutes, scrolled through Slack for another 15, had a team stand-up meeting that lasted 35 minutes where we talked about what we'd talk about in next week's planning meeting, responded to emails for 40 minutes, had coffee with Janet from marketing for 30 minutes because she wanted to pick my brain about a client presentation that I wasn't even involved in. Lunch at my desk, 30 minutes, but I spent 20 of those minutes refreshing my inbox. Another meeting from 1 to 2:30. More emails. A client call that could have been an email. More emails. And suddenly it was 6:30 and I felt exhausted but couldn't point to a single thing I'd actually accomplished. I wrote it all down, every minute. And when I looked at my spreadsheet that night, I wanted to cry. Out of 9 hours and 45 minutes at the office, I'd spent 4 hours and 20 minutes just on email. 4 hours. And most of those emails, not urgent, not important, just there. Notifications. CCs I didn't need to be on. Internal updates about projects I wasn't working on. I'd spent another 2 hours in meetings. And when I really thought about it, only one of those meetings required my presence. The rest? I was either a passive observer or someone had invited me just to cover themselves politically. By day 3, the pattern was clear. I was working 55 hours a week, but maybe 10 to 15 of those hours were actually productive. The rest was what Ferriss calls time wasters and time consumers. Interruptions, unnecessary meetings, email addiction, saying yes to every request because I was afraid of seeming unhelpful. And here's the really messed up part. I'd built my entire identity around being busy, being the person who always responded quickly, who always showed up, who never said no, and that identity was killing me. So, on day 4, I started the elimination experiment. I made a list of every task I did regularly and asked myself 2 questions Ferriss recommends. 1. What would happen if I simply didn't do this task? 2. If I had a heart attack and couldn't work for a month, would this task still need to happen? If the answer to question 1 was nothing bad, and the answer to question 2 was no, then that task was a candidate for elimination. And you know what I discovered? About 40% of my tasks fell into that category. 40%. Status update emails that nobody read, reports I compiled that went into a folder nobody checked, meetings I attended out of obligation where my contribution was nodding and saying, "Sounds good." I started with something small. I stopped attending the Friday afternoon team social hour. It wasn't mandatory, but I'd been going every week for 3 years because I thought it was important for team bonding. 2 hours every Friday, standing around drinking mediocre wine and making small talk. That's 104 hours a year. When I didn't show up that first Friday, I felt guilty, anxious, like I was betraying my team. But you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody even mentioned it. The next week, I eliminated 3 recurring meetings from my calendar, meetings where I literally never spoke. I sent polite emails. "I don't think my presence adds value here, but I'm happy to review notes afterward." One person responded, "One," and they said, "Makes sense, thanks for letting me know." The resistance came from inside my own head, not from other people. I kept waiting for someone to call me lazy, to question my commitment, to pull me aside and ask if everything was okay. But nobody did. Because here's the truth that nobody tells you. Most people are too busy worrying about their own stuff to monitor what you're doing. That realization was liberating and terrifying at the same time. I'd been performing productivity theater for an audience that didn't exist. By the end of week 1, I'd eliminated 7 hours from my work week. 7 hours. Just by saying no to things that didn't matter, just by not attending meetings I didn't need to attend, just by checking email 3 times a day instead of 3 times an hour. My actual output hadn't changed. My boss hadn't noticed. My clients hadn't complained. But I had 7 hours back. 7 hours that I used to leave the office at 5:30, go to an actual yoga class, and cook dinner for the first time in months. I tracked everything in my spreadsheet. Week 1 results. 55 hours down to 48 hours. Same output, same quality. But here's where it got complicated. Because while the elimination principle was working on paper, my brain was freaking out. I felt guilty leaving early. I felt anxious not responding to emails immediately. I felt like I was getting away with something wrong. And the hardest part? I had to fight the urge to fill those 7 hours with more work, to say yes to new projects, to prove I was still valuable. The elimination experiment was working, but the mental battle had just begun. Week 2 started with an email that made my stomach drop. My boss, Michael, wanted to schedule a one-on-one. No context, just, "Can we meet Tuesday at 2?" And immediately my brain went to the worst place. He'd noticed I was leaving early. Someone had complained I wasn't in meetings. I was getting fired. I spent the entire weekend convinced my elimination experiment had backfired. But when Tuesday came, and I sat in his office, you know what he said? "Great work on the Henderson report. Your turnaround time was impressive. Keep it up." That's when I realized something crucial. Nobody actually cared about my process. They cared about my results. That realization gave me the confidence to move to phase 2. Automation. This is where Ferriss gets really tactical in the book. He talks about creating systems, templates, and rules that handle repetitive tasks without your constant involvement. Setting up processes that run automatically so you're not manually doing the same thing over and over. For me, this meant looking at everything I did regularly and asking, can I systematize this? Can I create a template? Can I set up a rule that handles this without me? And the answer was yes, way more often than I expected. I started with email. 4 hours a day on email was insane, and most of those emails followed predictable patterns. Client check-ins, status updates, meeting scheduling, information requests. So I spent an entire Sunday afternoon creating email templates. Not those obvious canned responses that sound robotic. I mean thoughtful, personalized-sounding templates that I could customize in 30 seconds instead of writing from scratch every time. Template for project updates. Template for meeting requests. Template for, "I need more information before I can help you." Template for thanks, but I'm not the right person for this. By the end of that Sunday, I had 17 templates saved. The next step was batching. This is a huge concept in the book that I'd been completely ignoring my entire career. Instead of checking email constantly throughout the day, responding immediately to every notification, I set specific times to process email. 10 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 5 before leaving. That's it, 3 times a day. I turned off all notifications, email notifications, Slack notifications, phone notifications, everything. The first day I did this, I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. What if someone needed me urgently? What if a client had an emergency? What if I missed something important? But here's what actually happened. Nothing. Or rather, nothing bad. When I checked email at 10, I had 23 new messages. I processed them all in 35 minutes using my templates and batching similar responses together. At 2, another 18 messages, done in 28 minutes. At 5, 12 messages, 15 minutes. Total email time that day, 1 hour and 18 minutes. Compare that to the 4 hours and 20 minutes from week 1. I just bought myself 3 hours. 3 hours that I used to actually focus on deep work. Client analysis, strategy development. The stuff that actually mattered. Weeks 3 and 4 were about pushing these principles further and learning the hardest skill of all. Saying no. Not just to unnecessary meetings, but to actual requests, real projects, opportunities that sounded good but didn't align with my core responsibilities. Ferriss talks about selective ignorance, about protecting your time as fiercely as you protect your money, and I was terrible at it, absolutely terrible. My default response to any request was, yes, of course, happy to help, even when I was already overwhelmed, even when the request wasn't actually my job. So, I made a rule. Before saying yes to anything, I had to ask myself 3 questions. 1. Is this essential to my core responsibilities? 2. Will saying yes to this prevent me from doing something more important? 3. What am I giving up by saying yes? And then I had to sit with the discomfort of saying no. Janet from marketing asked if I could help with her client presentation. Old Vera would have said absolutely, spent 3 hours on it, and stayed late to catch up on my actual work. New Vera said, I'm focused on my own client deadlines right now, but I can recommend someone who'd be perfect for this. She said okay, and asked someone else. The world didn't end. My colleague David asked if I wanted to join a new committee about improving office culture. It met every Thursday for 90 minutes. Old Vera would have said yes because it sounded important and I didn't want to seem like I didn't care about the team. New Vera said, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I need to focus on my client work right now. He said no problem and moved on. Again, the world didn't end. Every time I said no, I waited for consequences. For someone to think less of me, for my reputation to suffer. But the consequences never came. Instead, something unexpected happened. People started respecting my time more. By week 4, my systems were running smoothly. Email templates saved me hours. Batching eliminated constant interruptions. Saying no protected my time for actual important work. I'd automated my weekly status reports using a simple spreadsheet that populated automatically. I'd created a client communication schedule so I wasn't reactively responding all day. I'd set up rules in my inbox that filtered and organized messages before I even saw them. My work hours dropped from 48 to 35. 35 hours. And here's the crazy part. My output hadn't decreased. If anything, it had increased because I was spending more time on high-value tasks and less time on busy work. But the guilt was still there. Every time I left at 5, I felt like I was cheating somehow. Every time I didn't respond to an email for 4 hours, I felt irresponsible. Every time I said no, I felt selfish. The systems were working. The data proved it. But my brain hadn't caught up yet. I was working less and producing more, and instead of celebrating, I was terrified someone would figure out my secret. That fear was about to get much worse. Week 5, October 16th. That's when everything started unraveling. I was sitting in a client meeting with Peterson Industries, one of our biggest accounts, and their CFO looked me straight in the eye and said, "Vera, you used to respond to my emails within an hour. Now it takes you half a day. Is everything okay?" My face went hot. My hands started sweating. And in that moment, every ounce of confidence I'd built over the past month evaporated. Because here's what I hadn't prepared for. The 4-hour work week works great when you're working in isolation. But I wasn't isolated. I had clients who expected immediate responses, colleagues who were used to my availability, a boss who'd built his workflow around my constant presence. I tried to explain my new email system, the batching, the efficiency gains, how I was actually producing better work by focusing in blocks instead of constantly reacting. But as the words came out of my mouth, they sounded like excuses, like I was justifying being lazy. The CFO nodded politely, but I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't impressed. He was concerned. After the meeting, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands shaking, seriously considering throwing my entire experiment in the trash. Maybe Ferriss's principles worked for entrepreneurs and tech bros, but not for people like me. Not for corporate employees with demanding clients and traditional office environments. Week 6 got worse. My team started asking questions. Why wasn't I on Slack all day anymore? Why had I declined that committee invitation? Why was I leaving at 5:30 when everyone else stayed until 7? And here's the thing about office culture that nobody talks about. It's not really about productivity. It's about performance. It's about being seen, being available, signaling that you're a team player. By working less, even though I was working smarter, I was violating an unspoken code, and my colleagues noticed. Sarah from the team pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "Hey, I've noticed you've been disconnecting a lot lately. Just checking if you're thinking about leaving or anything?" The paranoia started creeping in. Every time someone looked at me, I wondered if they were judging me. Every time I left before 6, I felt eyes on my back. Every time I said no to a request, I worried I was burning bridges. I started second-guessing everything. Maybe I had eliminated too much. Maybe my email template sounded cold and robotic. Maybe I was being selfish, prioritizing my own time over the team's needs. The guilt became overwhelming. And the worst part? I couldn't talk about it. How do you explain to your 50-hour-a-week colleagues that you're trying to work less? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, lazy. Week 7 was my breaking point. Michael scheduled another one-on-one, and this time it wasn't praise. He said, "I've gotten some feedback that you're not as engaged as you used to be, that you're hard to reach, that you're turning down opportunities to contribute. I need to know if there's something going on." And I just froze. Because I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't say I'm trying to work 4 hours a day based on a book by a guy who sells lifestyle optimization. So I lied. I said I'd been dealing with some personal stuff, but everything was fine now. I'd be more available, more engaged. And as I said those words, I felt my entire experiment crumbling. That night, I went home and rage-deleted my time-tracking spreadsheet. All that data, all those carefully logged hours. Gone. I turned my email notifications back on. I accepted 3 new project invitations I'd previously declined. I stayed online until 11 responding to non-urgent messages, because the social pressure was too much. The fear of being seen as uncommitted was too strong. And honestly, part of me felt relief. Going back to 50-hour weeks felt safe, familiar. At least nobody would question my dedication. At least I wouldn't have to defend my choices. At least I could blend back into the hustle culture and disappear. But here's what happened that broke me in a different way. On Friday night of week 7, I was sitting at my desk at 8:30 alone in the office, responding to an email that absolutely could have waited until Monday. And my phone rang. It was my mom. She said, "Your dad and I are at this new Italian restaurant downtown. We saved you a seat. Are you coming?" And I realized I'd forgotten. Again. We'd made plans 2 weeks earlier, dinner at 7:30, and I'd completely forgotten because I'd been too busy proving I wasn't lazy, too busy performing productivity, too busy working 50 hours to prove my 35-hour experiment wasn't making me a bad employee. I told my mom I couldn't make it. Work emergency. And after I hung up, I just sat there in the empty office staring at my computer screen and thought, what am I doing? I'd started this experiment because I was tired of missing my life, because I wanted to work to live, not live to work. And now I was back exactly where I started, except worse, because now I knew there was a different way. I'd tasted what it felt like to leave at 5:30 and cook dinner, to go to yoga, to see my friends, and I'd given it up because I was afraid of what other people might think. Week 8 was my rock bottom. Not because anything catastrophic happened, but because I was miserable. Back to 52 hours, back to constant email, back to saying yes to everything. And the productivity data didn't lie. I was working more hours but producing less value. The quality of my work had declined because I was scattered and reactive instead of focused and strategic. My client deliverables were fine, but they weren't excellent, and I was exhausted all over again. I'd proven the 4-hour workweek principles worked. The data showed it, but I'd let fear win. On Sunday of week 8, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my dad, and I told him everything: the experiment, the elimination, the automation, the pushback, the fear, the failure. And you know what he said? He said, "Vera, when I look back on my career, my biggest regret isn't the promotions I didn't get or the projects I didn't finish. It's the time I didn't spend with people I love. Don't make my mistakes." And something in his voice, the sadness mixed with wisdom, snapped me out of my spiral. I wasn't a victim of bad luck. I was a victim of bad boundaries. Monday morning, week 9, November 6th. I walked back into my office with a completely different mindset, not desperate to prove myself, not terrified of judgment, just clear about what mattered. My dad's words kept echoing in my head, "Don't make my mistakes." And I realized something fundamental had been wrong with my approach. I'd been trying to implement Ferriss's principles while still playing by everyone else's rules, still seeking approval, still performing for an audience. But the whole point of the 4-hour workweek isn't just about working less. It's about redefining what success means to you, and I'd been too scared to actually do that. So I made a decision. I was going to restart the experiment, but this time with one crucial difference. I wasn't going to hide it. I wasn't going to apologize for it. I was going to be transparent about my boundaries and let the chips fall where they may. That Monday, I scheduled a meeting with Michael. I walked into his office and I said, "I need to talk to you about how I'm working. For the past 2 months, I've been experimenting with productivity strategies that have significantly reduced my working hours while maintaining my output. But I've been doing it secretly because I was afraid of how it would look. I want to be transparent about it now. Here's my data. Here's what I've been doing, and here's why it's working." I showed him my spreadsheet from weeks 1 through 4, the elimination of unnecessary meetings, the email batching results, the automation systems I'd built, the output metrics that proved my work quality hadn't declined. And then I showed him weeks 5 through 8, where I'd backslid, and how my productivity had actually decreased when I went back to 50 hours. Michael sat there for a long moment just looking at the data. And then he said something I never expected. He said, "This is exactly the kind of efficiency thinking we need more of. Why didn't you just tell me you were doing this?" I was speechless. I'd been terrified of this conversation for 2 months, and his response was positive. That conversation changed everything. Because once I stopped hiding, once I stopped apologizing, I could actually push the principles further. Week 9 was about true delegation, the third pillar I'd been too scared to implement. Delegation isn't just about dumping work on other people. It's about recognizing that some tasks would be better done by someone else, either because they have different skills or because the task is below your pay grade. I'd been holding on to tasks that weren't strategic, weren't important, but felt comfortable because I'd always done them. Compiling weekly reports, scheduling client calls, formatting presentations, basic data entry. I sat down with Rachel, our junior analyst, and I said, "I want to teach you how to do these 5 tasks that I currently handle. Not because I'm trying to offload work onto you, but because these are great learning opportunities and they're taking me away from higher value work. Can we spend this week having me show you my process?" She was thrilled. Absolutely thrilled. Because nobody had ever offered to mentor her before. Everyone was too busy hoarding their tasks and protecting their territory. So I spent week 9 training her on reports, call scheduling, and presentation formatting. It took probably 6 hours of my time that week. But by week 10, those tasks were off my plate completely. That was another 4 hours per week I'd just reclaimed. Week 10 was about ruthless prioritization. And this is where I finally understood what Ferriss means by the 80-20 rule. Not just understanding it intellectually, but living it. I made a list of all my client accounts, 16 total accounts that I managed. And then I did something radical. I ranked them by revenue, by strategic importance, and by how much time they consumed. What I discovered shocked me. 3 accounts generated 68% of my revenue and maybe 15% of my headaches. The other 13 accounts generated 32% of revenue, but consumed 85% of my time and caused 90% of my stress. I brought this data to Michael and I said, what if we redistributed some of these smaller accounts? What if I focused exclusively on our top-tier clients where I can provide real strategic value, and we let other team members handle the smaller accounts? He thought about it for maybe 10 seconds and said, makes sense, do it, just like that. I'd been managing 16 accounts when I should have been managing 3, and nobody had questioned it because that's just how things had always been done. By week 11, I was down to 5 key accounts: high value, strategic, work that actually mattered. And my total client management time dropped from 20 hours a week to 12. Week 11 was also when I finally mastered batching at an advanced level. Not just batching emails, but batching everything. Client calls all happened on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, no exceptions. Internal meetings all happened on Wednesday afternoons. Monday and Friday were completely meeting-free for deep work. When clients asked for calls outside those windows, I politely said, I batch all my client calls on Tuesdays and Thursdays to ensure I can give you my full attention. Does Tuesday at 10 work? And you know what? They said yes. Every single time. Because when you're confident about your boundaries, people respect them. I also implemented something Ferriss calls selective ignorance. I unsubscribed from 73 email newsletters I never read. I left 4 Slack channels that were just noise. I stopped attending industry webinars that I signed up for out of FOMO but never got value from. I deleted LinkedIn from my phone. Every source of information that wasn't directly relevant to my core work got eliminated. And the mental space that created was incredible. I wasn't constantly consuming and reacting. I was thinking and creating. By week 12, I was working 22 hours a week. 22 hours. And here's the part that still blows my mind. I pulled my performance metrics for the quarter. Client satisfaction scores, deliverable quality ratings, revenue per hour worked. Every single metric had improved compared to the previous quarter when I'd been working 55 hours. I was producing more value in 22 hours than I had in 55. The data was undeniable. The 80-20 rule wasn't just theory. When you eliminate the 80% that doesn't matter and focus obsessively on the 20% that does, you don't just work less, you work better. The breakthrough wasn't about time management, it was about value management. It was about having the courage to say this matters and this doesn't, to prioritize ruthlessly, to delegate without guilt, to batch without exception, to say no without apology. And most importantly, it was about redefining productivity. Productivity isn't hours worked, it's value created per hour worked. And by that metric, I'd become 10 times more productive while working 60% fewer hours. December 15th. 90 days since I sat on my bathroom floor at 3 a.m. reading Tim Ferriss's book and deciding to test every principle. 90 days since I was working 55 hours a week, missing my life, and drowning in busy work. And here's what I want to tell you right now, sitting here with all my data, all my spreadsheets, all my documented hours. The 4-hour workweek is misleading. The title is clickbait. I never got down to 4 hours, not even close. But the principles behind that provocative title, they changed my entire life. And I need to be brutally honest about what worked, what didn't, and what I'm keeping forever. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers don't lie. Week 1, 55 hours. Week 12, 22 hours. That's a 60% reduction in working hours. But here's where it gets interesting. My output didn't drop 60%. My revenue per hour actually increased by 43%. My client satisfaction scores went up. My quality metrics improved. I was producing more value in less time because I'd eliminated all the garbage that was masking as work. The 80-20 rule was real. Painfully, obviously real. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Most of what I'd been doing for 5 years was theater, performance, busy work that made me feel productive but created zero value. But 22 hours wasn't sustainable either, and here's why. I'd eliminated so much that I started losing important context. I wasn't in enough meetings to understand broader company strategy. I wasn't connected enough to my team to mentor effectively. I wasn't visible enough to my clients to maintain relationships beyond deliverables. Ferriss writes from the perspective of an entrepreneur who controls his entire business. I'm an employee in a corporate structure. Those are fundamentally different situations. You can't just eliminate 90% of your job and expect everything to work smoothly. Some of that connectivity, that presence, that availability actually matters. So I adjusted. I found my sustainable number, and it's 30 hours a week where I'm producing high-value work, maintaining relationships, staying connected to my team, and still having a life outside the office. That's a 45% reduction from where I started. That's reclaiming 25 hours every single week. Over a year, that's 1,300 hours. That's 54 full days. I got almost 2 months of my life back, and I'm never giving that up again. Never. Because here's what I did with those 1,300 hours. I went to yoga 3 times a week. I cooked dinner. I saw my friends. I read books. I took a weekend trip to the mountains. I had dinner with my parents every Sunday. I lived. Here's what I'm keeping permanently from the 4-hour workweek principles. Elimination first, always. Before optimizing or automating any task, I ask, does this need to exist at all? 40% of what I was doing didn't need to exist. Email batching 3 times a day, no exceptions. Notifications stay off. This one habit alone saves me 2 hours daily. Batching everything possible. Client calls on Tuesday and Thursday only. Internal meetings Wednesday afternoons only. Deep work blocks Monday and Friday. No exceptions unless it's genuinely urgent. And urgent means client emergency, not someone else's poor planning. Templates and automation for everything repetitive. I now have 26 email templates, 4 presentation templates, 3 report templates, and automated systems that handle routine tasks without my involvement. This isn't about being lazy. It's about not reinventing the wheel every single time. Ruthless prioritization using the 80-20 rule. I regularly audit my tasks and ask, which 20% of my activities produce 80% of my results? Everything else gets eliminated, delegated, or minimized. Delegation without guilt. Training Rachel wasn't just good for me. It was good for her career development. Delegation done right is mentorship. It's creating systems that don't depend on you being the bottleneck. Non-negotiable boundaries. I leave at 5. I don't check email after 6. I don't work weekends unless there's a genuine crisis, and genuine crises happen maybe twice a year, not twice a week. These boundaries aren't selfish. They're necessary. Because burned out Vera serving clients at 55 hours was worse than focused Vera serving clients at 30 hours. The quality difference was measurable. And here's what I abandoned from the book because it was unrealistic or didn't fit my situation. The 4-hour workweek itself. It's not achievable for most people in traditional employment, and that's okay. The goal isn't 4 hours. The goal is reclaiming your time and your life. Extreme outsourcing. Ferriss talks about virtual assistants and outsourcing everything. For my role, that created more problems than it solved. Some things I just need to do myself. Selective ignorance taken too far. I tried completely disconnecting from industry news and company updates. Bad idea. You need enough information to stay relevant and effective. The key is filtering ruthlessly, not going completely dark. Mini retirements and geographic arbitrage. Great if you're self-employed. Not realistic when you have a corporate job with specific location requirements. And that's fine. Not every principle applies to every situation. But here's the real truth that nobody talks about. The 4-hour workweek isn't really about working 4 hours. It's about questioning the default mode. It's about asking why before accepting the status quo. It's about recognizing that busy doesn't equal productive. That hours worked doesn't equal value created. That saying yes to everything means saying no to the things that actually matter. The book gave me permission to redesign my work around my life, instead of designing my life around my work. And that shift in mindset was worth everything. So, where am I now? I work 30 hours a week. I manage 5 high-value client accounts instead of 16 mediocre ones. I have systems that run without constant intervention. I have boundaries that people respect because I respect them first. I leave the office at 5, and I don't feel guilty. I see my parents every Sunday. I go to yoga. I cook dinner. I read books. I sleep 8 hours. I have a life. And my career hasn't suffered. My boss is happy. My clients are happy. My performance reviews are better than they were when I was working 55 hours. Because productivity isn't about time. It's about focus. It's about value. It's about doing the right things instead of all the things. If you're sitting there right now, working 50 or 60 hours a week, feeling exhausted, missing your life, wondering if there's another way, there is. But it requires courage. Courage to eliminate tasks that don't matter. Courage to say no. Courage to set boundaries. Courage to prioritize value over hours. Courage to stop performing productivity and start creating it. The 4-hour workweek isn't a blueprint. It's an invitation to question everything you've been told about work and success and what it means to be productive. Take that invitation. Start tracking your time. Identify your 20%. Eliminate ruthlessly. Your life is waiting.